The smell of burning did not appear immediately. At first, it seemed like it was just dust on the radiators or an old iron that hadn't been turned on in a long time. But by evening, the smell had become stronger, as if something was smoldering under the floor. Peter opened the window and looked down. The yard was quiet. Not even a cat in sight. He sniffed the air, wrinkling his nose, and realized that the smell was coming from the attic. The house was old, built after the war, with wooden floors. There was always a damp smell coming from there, but not smoke. He climbed the stairs, holding a flashlight, and on the last flight of stairs he noticed a thin strip of light coming from under the door to the attic, even though the light bulb there hadn't been working for 20 years. He pushed the door. It creaked, letting him in. The air was thick and dusty, and gnats danced in the beam of the flashlight. The light was not coming from the lamp, but from an old television set standing on some boxes. It was a record, a massive box with rounded glass, covered in dust. But the screen flickered pale green. There was no cable. The wire was broken, and the plug lay on the floor. Peter moved closer. The image on the screen was moving. A newsreader in a dark suit was reading the news. Behind him was the date, November 26th, 2026. It was October, outside. He didn't touch the TV. He would have pulled the cord, but it wasn't in the socket anyway. He turned and went downstairs. It was quiet downstairs, as if the sound had stayed upstairs. That night, he couldn't fall asleep for a long time. He kept remembering the newsreader's expression and the caption below him, local news. The small screen in the attic showed what it couldn't show. The next morning, he decided it was just a glitch from the flashlight. The light had reflected. But his curiosity wouldn't let go. Peter had been a radio mechanic in the past, repairing equipment until he was laid off. Now he lived on his pension and sometimes helped his neighbors with their outlets. In the summer, his daughter bought a new TV, and he took the old one to his dacha. The house felt empty. In the evenings, he listened to the radio or just sat in the kitchen with a book. So the idea of the old record caught his attention. He decided to take it down, clean it up, and see if he could sell it to an antique dealer. By lunchtime, he was already standing in the attic with a rag and a screwdriver. He dusted it off, wiped the screen, and the image flashed back on. This time, the announcer was talking about utility problems. There was a short circuit in house number 12 on Stroitley Street. No one was injured. Peter smiled. His house was at that very number. At that moment, somewhere below, an automatic switch clicked, and the lights flickered. He went downstairs. His downstairs neighbor's fuses had blown, and she was waving her arms around, swearing. She said that the old light fixture had sparked. Everything coincided strangely. Peter decided to write it down. He took a notebook and noted the date and time. A couple of hours later, the announcer read another news item. An abandoned car has been found in the courtyard, blocking the passage. He looked out the window. There was an old Lada 9 in the courtyard, which had not been there in the morning. At first, it all seemed like a coincidence, but it happened again. The TV showed a store sign falling, and in the evening, it was indeed hanging crookedly, torn down by the wind. Peter stopped laughing. He started turning on the TV every day. On the screen were the same gray news, the emotionless announcer, the old fonts. The date was one day ahead. He noticed small details. The same man in a sweater walked behind the announcer every episode. The announcer always had a folder, but every day it got thicker. Peter began to take notes. A week later, the announcer said his name for the first time, at first uncertainly, as if in the context of general news. A resident of house number 12, Peter Ivanovich, reported a gas leak. He shuddered. There was no gas. He hadn't reported anything. Everything in the kitchen was in working order. He checked the burners, the cylinder, even called the dispatch center. They were surprised. By evening, the smell of gas had indeed appeared. A heavy smell wafted from under the neighbor's door on the landing. He knocked and called out, but no one answered. He had to call the emergency services. It turned out that the landlady had forgotten to turn off the stove. After that, he stopped writing down the news. It had become too accurate. Instead, he tried to figure out the TV's circuitry, to understand where the power was coming from. But the device showed 0. The TV was not connected, and the lamps inside barely glowed, as if from internal voltage. He removed the back cover. There was a yellowed receipt there, addressed to Ivanov Pyotr Ivanovich. Only the date was 1986. That was the year he was born. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the surname matched. He didn't remember his family ever buying a record. That evening, he called his daughter. He told her that he had found an old TV that shows strange things. She laughed it off, saying that he was just bored, and advised him to throw it away. He said he would try, but he didn't throw it away. The next day, the announcer reported that a faulty device, a potential source of fire, was found in the attic of house number 12. Peter realized that he was talking about his TV. He went upstairs and sat down in front of the screen. It was dark, but when he looked closer, he saw the announcer's reflection moving in the glass. Without sound, his lips moving. He saw his own reflection next to it, and the announcer turned his head as if looking directly at him. He recoiled and pulled out the cable, even though there was no cable. The flashlight in his hand blinked, and the screen went dark. But the frozen image of the announcer's face remained visible, like a trace of a flash. He closed the attic. Over the next few days, he avoided going up there. However, the strange occurrences continued. The mailbox filled up with receipts addressed to other residents, but with his address. A key lay on the stairs, identical to the one for his apartment, only with the number worn off. Someone had left a cardboard box in the basement with the word archive written on it. Inside were building maintenance logs and old records. One of them stated that before Peter's family moved in, an electrician had lived in the apartment and died in the attic during repairs. His last name was Ivanov. He read the line several times, not immediately understanding. So, before them, a man with the same name had lived here, who died from a short circuit while repairing equipment, and he had a TV. This detail did not frighten him. On the contrary, it brought a strange calm. The coincidence was explained by the document. But at night, there was a smell of burning again, and again from the attic. He went upstairs. The door was ajar. It was dark inside, but a faint light was coming from under the TV. The screen was on, even though the cord was still lying on the floor. On the screen, the announcer was leafing through a folder, then looked up and said his name, followed by tomorrow's date. Under the caption was a short line: viewer who watched the episode to the end. Peter froze. The screen dimmed, then flashed again, showing the stairwell of his building, as if filmed by a security camera. Someone's shadow lay on the steps. He recognized the railing, recognized his slippers. He turned off his flashlight and stood in the dark until his eyes adjusted. The screen glowed with an even light. There was a quiet rustling sound, as if someone were turning pages. There was no announcer, but a reflection moved on the glass, and the lips were still moving, silently, as if continuing the broadcast. He didn't wait for the end of the broadcast. He went downstairs, locked the door, and closed his eyes. But downstairs, in the silence of the apartment, it seemed to him that he could still hear the sound of paper rustling, as if the news feed was still running somewhere inside the walls. In the morning, he woke up to noise. Buckets clattered, and keys jangled on the stairs. The utility workers had arrived. They said they were going to check the attic and the heating pipes. Peter nodded, showing no sign of excitement, and sat in the kitchen while they went upstairs. He heard footsteps upstairs. Then someone shouted, "Look! It works!" Then there was a thud, a dull thump. 5 minutes later, everything was quiet. The attic door remained ajar. When he went out into the stairwell, no one was there. There were empty buckets on the landing and dirty footprints on the steps. He went upstairs and looked in the attic. The TV was off, but the screen was warm, as if it had been touched recently. There was a receipt on the box, new white, signed by an inspector who had never come to their house. Today's date was in the inspection column, and his surname was in the tenant signature column. He hadn't signed it. He went downstairs, sat down on a stool by the door, and sat there for a long time, feeling fatigue creeping under his skin. His downstairs neighbor, Aunt Rhea, brought him a key. She said she found it under the rug and thought it was his. The key did fit his lock, but the head was stamped with the old font, Z4. They hadn't made those for 30 years. He tried to open the storage room in the basement with it. The lock was rusty. Inside, it smelled of lime and iron. Old envelopes tied with string lay on the shelf. The address was his house, apartment 12, but the years were the 60s and 70s. He didn't dare read them all. He opened one. It was a report on the testing of electrical appliances, with the surname of that very electrician, Ivanov. And the date of death coincided with the date of purchase of the TV. Peter didn't believe in coincidences, but the chain of events was too precise. He realized that the TV could have belonged to this Ivanov, and perhaps that was how it all ended. A short circuit, a fire, death. Maybe the current passed through the case. But why did the screen continue to work? He took out an old multimeter and checked the voltage. 0. He checked the insulation. Clean. But as soon as he brought the probe close to the glass, the needle jumped, as if something was moving behind the screen. That evening, the TV turned on by itself. No sound, no announcer. On the screen was the staircase of the entrance, filmed from above, and a thin strip of light from a flashlight. He thought it was a camera, but there was no camera. He called his neighbor. She said she couldn't see anything, just interference. When she left, the screen came back to life. The announcer was sitting at a table with 2 folders in front of him. One of them was the one Peter had seen before, now open. On the first page was his name, date of birth, and the words, "Examination complete." He turned off the TV and turned away, but the light from the screen slowly filled the room, even through his closed eyelids. Then he took an old cover out of the closet and covered the device. The light shone through the fabric. He couldn't sleep. At 3 in the morning, he heard footsteps behind the wall. Then someone came down the stairs, quietly, slowly, with pauses, like a person, with a crutch. Peter looked through the peephole. No one was there, but there was a piece of paper under the door. "Please hand in your keys for inspection." The signature was the same as on the receipt from the attic. The next day, he went to the building management office. They knew nothing about any inspection or any inspector. The woman at the window said that the attic was closed for repairs, and no one was allowed to go up there. He wanted to argue, but kept quiet. He only asked who had worked there before. She said that in the 70s, a senior electrician named Ivanov had lived there, but he had died from an electric shock, and then his son had moved to another city. Peter felt a chill rise in his throat. When he was a child, his mother told him that their apartment had been given to them in turn after the fire repairs. He had never connected the 2 facts. When he returned home, he found that the TV was on again. There was a recording on the screen. The announcer was talking about an old house that was being prepared for demolition. Then the camera changed the shot. It showed Peter's room, his desk, his notebook. Everything was exactly as it was now. He moved closer. The announcer turned his head and said, silently but clearly with his lips, that everything was going according to plan. That evening, Peter took the TV outside. He placed it next to the trash cans and covered it with a rag. But at night, looking out the window, he saw that the rag had slipped off and the screen was flickering. A janitor was passing by, stopped, looked, and, as if spellbound, sat down in front of it. In the morning, the TV was gone. Peter sighed with relief. But that same day, his daughter called him. She said she had seen an old TV in the yard that looked very similar to theirs, and wanted to take it as an antique, but someone had already taken it away. In the evening, he turned on the radio and heard the familiar voice of the announcer. He was reading the news about house number 12, where an inspection had been carried out and radiation levels above the norm had been detected. Peter turned off the radio, but the sound did not stop. He realized that the voice was not coming from the radio, but from the old electrical outlet cover. He opened the panel and found a rolled-up wire inside, burnt at the end. The insulation smelled of burning. He took a flashlight and went up to the attic. Only an empty box stood in place of the TV. A rectangular mark remained on the wall, clean, as if something heavy had recently been removed. An old spool of wire and a piece of fabric, once used to wrap the equipment, lay in the corner. On the fabric was a handprint, burned as if by a soldering iron. He sat down on the floor, leaning on his knees. It felt as if the house was listening to him breathe. Suddenly, there was a click somewhere under the roof, and a thin shadow ran across the wall, as if the wire had moved on its own. Then he decided to check the archive documents that were lying in the basement. There, among the papers, he found a photograph. A man in a work coat who looked like him. The same shape of face, the same crease at the lips. On the back was a caption, "Checking the circuit, June." The year was illegible. He took the photo home. At night, he put it next to his bed without looking at it. But in the morning, the photo was under the glass of the TV, which now stood by the door. The screen was black, but it reflected the room too brightly, as if illuminated from within. He realized that the TV had returned. He didn't open his eyes right away. At first, he thought it was all a dream, but the smell of dust and ozone was too real. The TV stood by the door as if someone had brought it and placed it carefully so as not to scratch the floor. The cord trailed to the outlet but was not plugged in. The screen glowed from within with a dim light, like a breath. Peter moved closer. On the glass was his room, only slightly altered. There was no calendar on the wall in the reflection, and the lamp was not lit. He stood there, hesitating to touch the case. A short noise, like a person's breath, escaped from the speakers. Then silence. A couple of hours later, there was a knock at the door. Standing on the doorstep was a man in a blue jacket with the words "energy metering" written on it. He said that he was there to check the grounding in the building and asked for the apartment number. Everything matched. Pyotr wanted to say that no inspections had been scheduled, but he noticed an old-style badge on the man's chest, the kind that hadn't been issued for a long time. He looked about 45 years old, with calm eyes and a quiet voice. The man introduced himself as Alexei and said that he had been sent at the request of a resident named Pyotr Ivanovich. Pyotr nodded, not surprised. Nothing seemed important anymore. Alexei came in, examined the electrical outlets, and asked to see the attic. The attic contained only dust, boxes, and a mark on the wall where a TV had been. Alexei looked around for a long time, as if remembering something. Then he said that the house was old, the wiring was worn out, and if there was an open connection somewhere, it could pick up interference like an antenna. Peter listened, feeling a strange sense of relief. At least there was some explanation. Alexei suggested checking everything together, took out a device that looked like a small oscilloscope, and connected the probes to the wall. Wavy lines appeared on the screen, then suddenly formed into straight lines, and a quiet voice from the speaker announced today's date. Alexei frowned and said that such readings should not be there, as if someone was sending a weak signal from inside the network. He left the device with Peter and promised to come back in the evening with his partner. As he was leaving, he looked at the old TV by the door and quietly said that such models were produced in limited quantities for closed communications institutions, where the signal was transmitted via an internal cable. Peter asked how he knew that. Alexei smiled and said that his father had worked as an electrician in the same building many years ago. When the door closed behind him, Peter realized that he hadn't given his last name. In the evening, the TV turned on again. On the screen was a corridor lit by cold light and the silhouette of a man in a blue jacket climbing the stairs. There was a quiet, crackling sound coming from the speaker, as if someone were leafing through a notebook. A minute later, the doorbell rang. Alexei had returned. With him was a woman, wearing glasses, an engineer from the communications department. She asked where the device was located. She looked at the TV screen and turned pale. She said that the signal was not coming from the network, but from a closed circuit. It was as if the house itself was generating a reflection in which the old frequencies were imprinted. Alexei added that this happens when someone connects the old grounding circuit to the new line during repairs. He looked at Peter. Maybe you did it yourself when you repaired the outlet? Peter remembered. A week ago, he had indeed replaced the aluminum wire with copper and connected it directly to the outlet housing so that it wouldn't hum. At the time, he didn't know that this wire ran straight to the attic. The woman suggested temporarily disconnecting the circuit. They removed the terminal and insulated it. The TV went out. Peter sighed with relief. Alexei said he would come by tomorrow with the documents. During the night, Peter woke up from the light. The screen was on again. It showed the same room, but without him in it. In the reflection, a man was sitting at a table and writing something in a notebook. There was no announcer's desk, just the same interior, only without sound. He came closer and realized that the reflection was Alexei, only younger, in an old jumpsuit. On the wall behind him was a poster with Soviet-style electrical safety rules. He was leafing through a magazine and making notes. Then he looked up, and the words, "Check complete," flashed across his lips. Peter realized he was watching a recording, but couldn't figure out where it was coming from. He took out the device Alexei had left behind, turned it on, and numbers flashed on the screen, followed by waves. The signal was coming from the TV. He tried switching modes, and then the device emitted a short pulse. The TV screen flickered, and the image began to change. Now the announcer was sitting at the table again, and next to him was the same woman, with glasses, who had been speaking earlier that day. They discussed something without sound. Then the announcer raised his head and said clearly, The check is complete. The house is isolated. The camera zoomed in on his face, and Peter saw that the announcer's eyes were not human, but glassy, like lenses. He turned off the TV, threw a rag over it, and went out into the stairwell. The light in the stairwell was flickering. At that moment, there was a dull thud upstairs, as if a board had fallen. He went up and saw Alexei. He was standing at the attic door, pale, holding the same device in his hands. He said he had decided to check the signal at night because the device was showing activity. Peter noticed that a red indicator on the device's body was flashing in time with Alexei's breathing. Alexei looked up. If the signal is coming from the walls, it can only be turned off through the old grounding circuit. But to do that, we need to get to the connection point, right under the roof. They went up. It was quiet in the attic. The air was cold and smelled of iron. Alexei found an old distribution board and opened it. Inside, instead of terminals, there was a round metal plate with engraved numbers, like on a dial. In the middle was a thin needle connected to a wire. He touched it with a screwdriver, and the needle moved, bringing the device's screen to life. The announcer's face appeared on it. But now the background was not a studio, but black. And both Alexei and Peter were visible in the reflection. The announcer said one word: return. At that very moment, the needle jerked, a spark flew out of the shield, and the device fell. Alexei pushed Peter away so that he would not be hit by the discharge. The light went out. When the lantern lit up again, Alexei was lying on the floor, unconscious. The device was smoking, but it was intact. Peter pulled it out of the dust and looked at the screen, which flashed, signal reset. He realized that the circuit had been broken. He called an ambulance. Alexei was taken away with a burn on his hand, but alive. Before they took him away, he said only one thing: the house is quiet now. After that, the TV was silent. For a week, then another. Peter began to sleep peacefully and even put away his notebook. It seemed that everything was over. But one morning he took an unstamped envelope out of the mailbox. Inside was a receipt for replacement equipment, signed by Alexei. In the inspector column was the surname Ivanov. At the bottom was a note: signal redirected. Inspection continues. He looked up, and in the hallway mirror, the TV screen reflected a faint green light, even though it was turned off. Peter sat for a long time with the envelope in his hands. The paper was new, the ink fresh. There was a stamp on the receipt, but the impression was smudged, as if it had been applied by a hand unaccustomed to using a stamp. He placed the sheet on the table next to the photo of the electrician from the basement. Now the resemblance was obvious. The shape of the eyebrows, the chin, the wrinkles around the eyes, like a reflection across a generation. Peter realized that it was not just a coincidence of surnames. He took out an old folder with his mother's documents. Among them was a warrant for the apartment, issued 2 years after the fire. In the previous tenant column was Ivanov AA. His mother always said that they were just lucky with the Q. At the time, he didn't ask why she avoided talking about who had lived there before. Now everything was falling into place. The day passed quietly, but towards evening the radio hissed again. The announcer's voice emerged from the hissing. Today, the final inspection of the circuit in house number 12 is being completed. All readings are normal. The voice sounded tired, almost human. Then he added, "Viewers who watched the broadcast to the end can consider themselves free." Peter did not touch the radio, but he heard a quiet crackling sound coming from the wall where the TV had once stood. He got up and looked. A faint light was flashing in the socket. It was as if someone inside was blinking a light bulb. He understood. The circuit had closed again. Only now it wasn't through the wiring, but through him, through his memory. He remembered Alexei's words. The house is old. The signals don't disappear. They settle in the walls like a smell. If the signal could really be recorded, then something from the past remained here. Maybe not energy, but habit. He decided to go down to the basement. Where he had found the archive, there was another door, covered with rubbish. He cleared the passageway, opened it, and found a small room inside, a former workshop. On the wall was an old shield, exactly like the one upstairs. Next to it stood a metal box engraved with the words, "Local Relay." Inside were charred circuit boards, a piece of wire, and a sign that read, "Feedback Point." He realized that the house was not just a dwelling. At one time, an internal broadcasting system had been tested here. Every outlet, every line, was part of a ring where sound and image traveled along a common circuit. After the fire, the system was not turned off. It was simply forgotten. And now, when he connected the old line to the new one, the circuit closed again, as if the memory of the house had awakened. He went back upstairs. His neighbor Raya was waiting for him on the stairs, her hands shaking, and said that they had just announced on TV. An inspection of resident Ivanov is being carried out in house number 12. He felt a chill rising from his feet. He went into the apartment. The screen was indeed on. The announcer sat calmly, as always, but behind him was no longer a background, but a mirror image of Peter's room. The announcer leafed through a folder and said, "The previous signal has been eliminated. A new operator has been assigned." At the last word, the image flickered, and an old photograph of the electrician fell onto the announcer's desk. The very one Peter had been holding that morning. He sat down on a stool. The screen did not turn off, although the wire was still lying to one side. The announcer closed the folder, looked directly into the camera, and added, "Recording time, now." Peter realized that what he was seeing was not a live broadcast, but a reflection. Only it wasn't a mirror image, but as if in reverse, his own movements appeared on the screen slightly before he made them. He raised his hand. His hand was already raised on the screen. He said to himself, "Enough." At that moment, the announcer whispered the same thing, but a little earlier. He walked over to the TV and touched the glass. It was cold, but he could feel a slight vibration under his fingers, like from an old transformer. He remembered all of Alexei's words, the attic sparks, the photographs, the captions. Everything was connected by a single line. through memory and electricity. He knew that the circuit could only be broken physically, by disconnecting what connected the house and the grid. That meant cutting the wire in the attic. He took a tool and climbed up. The attic was dark, but he knew his way around. The panel where he and Alexei had found the plate was open. In the center, the same needle flickered, now burning with an even light. He cut the wire at the base and smelled the scent of heated metal. At that very moment, the lights in the house went out, the TV screen flashed white, and then there was silence. Only the air hummed slightly, as it does after a thunderstorm. He went downstairs and sat on the bed. His room was dark in the mirror, ordinary and quiet. The TV was black, dead, without reflection. A week later, Alexei arrived, his arm in a sling, his face tired. He said that the checks were complete, and the network was now completely de-energized. He placed a stamped piece of paper on the table. Conclusion: circuit eliminated. Then he looked at the electrician's photo and asked whose picture it was. Pyotr replied that he thought it was a relative. Alexei looked closely and nodded. So now the circle is truly complete. They drank tea. Alexei left. Peter put the photo in a drawer and took the TV to the basement. He locked it and stuck a sign on it: "Do not connect." Several weeks passed. The house became quieter. Even the neighbors said that it was as if the walls had stopped humming. In the evenings, Peter sat in the kitchen and listened to the radio. Everything was normal. Only sometimes, when he turned off the light, the silhouette of a person at the table was reflected in the black glass of the window. Without a lectern, just sitting and writing something. He wasn't afraid. He knew it was a remnant of the signal, the inertia of old memories. This happens with houses and with people. It is important that the current does not continue, but simply fades away gradually. Before going to bed, he always walked past the TV, which was now downstairs in the basement, and touched the door with his palm. The glass no longer glowed. Sometimes it seemed as if there was a faint clicking sound coming from inside, as if someone was checking the connection. Peter smiled. He told himself that everything was probably fine. The check was indeed complete. And in this silence in the old house, among the walls saturated with the echoes of currents and voices, silence finally settled in. Not frightening, but right. The kind that remains after a connection has been fixed.